Back at it again, baby, and we have another one with the brother Thomas Sowell. Let's dive in.
The instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean.
Yeah, one thing that I've learned is that slavery wasn't started based on racism. And for years, that was something that I had always thought, black people were enslaved because white people hated us, kind of situation. And that wasn't the case. In fact, it was black people that sold us, which is the crazy thing to learn. And for me, it was eye-opening learning about that because it was never taught in school. I was never taught that black people sold black people into slavery. That just, I had no clue about it. And knowing it now, it's very, very interesting because I feel like there's a large number of people that don't know that. Did racism get entangled into slavery later on? Yeah, sure, obviously. But the start of it, at least here in America, it wasn't racism. Obviously, there was slavery everywhere on this planet. And for the most part, as you just mentioned, it was slavery amongst people that looked, sounded just like you. They just happened to be weak.
People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were
Most people were slaves because they were vulnerable, not how they looked.
enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere. Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere. Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself. Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922.
Several of you guys have let me know in the comment section, which I do read through the comment section, and I've even been going back to older videos and checking the comments, but have let me know that slavery is still going on. I believe you guys have been saying Libya, if I remember correctly, that I read in the comment section. Let me know. And if there's a video on it, send it my way. I definitely want to check it out. All right.
Before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book and widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by." This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making.
I guess I can give him credit for coming out and admitting, hey, I tried to give them a myth to live by. I'll give him a little bit of credit, but sheesh.
Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible. Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples. The same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia.
It was nothing new.
In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors. And the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was, with some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners. Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
Stuff you are never taught in school. I never was taught that there was black slave owners. Not ever. And I think that's important. I think that's important because you paint white people with this brush that it was all white people that owned slaves and all white people were racist, which is why they had slaves. And then don't get me wrong, slavery was horrible. It was terrible. There are some racist and were some racist individuals, but when you make it sound like white people were the only people doing it on this planet, you know, like I just find a problem with that when you don't learn true history, because it was going on around the world. Not saying that it was right, not saying that, you know what I mean, but it was going on around the world. And I think it's important that that is taught in schools, and also that there were black slave owners. Black people owned slaves. I'm not saying there was like a huge, segment of black slave owners, but the fact that there were is a very important missing piece to the puzzle that was never there when I was younger. That's crazy to me. We got to teach true history, not just bits and pieces of it. That's just my opinion. Y'all let me know how you feel about it.
An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came. Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies. Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans, the backwaters of Asia, and much of sub-Saharan Africa. By the early modern era, sub-Saharan Africa, with its numerous and severe geographic handicaps, was one of the last remaining areas from which vast numbers of people could be enslaved.
Interesting facts to learn about, and it's crazy to even think that we are one of the only places that ended slavery in the way that we did, in a bloody, death-filled war. It's crazy to think about. There was a war to end that. Like I said earlier, I think it's important that we teach the whole history, the true history, I should say, and not just bits and pieces and segments. But maybe that's just me. Y'all let me know how you feel about it in the comment section below. Like, share, comment, and of course, hit that subscribe button. A lot of people have been getting unsubscribed from the channel, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel, whether that's on your TV, your notepad, your phone. You can subscribe anywhere, but make sure you are subscribed to the channel. YouTube has been unsubscribing people from the channel. But love y'all. Peace and love. I'm out.